million. So let's move to JJ. What's worrying you? Like, what's keeping you up about this?
Well, yeah, so I've been pretty outspoken in opposition to this bill, and I feel like some of the popularity of some of my content has inspired some other Canadian content creators to weigh in on the bill as well, and so I kind of feel like I've gotten a pretty good sort of assessment of where a lot of creators' anxieties are coming from as far as this goes. You know, I think that it's very important to listen to what the government has said quite explicitly is their agenda in pushing for this legislation. And what the government has said quite explicitly is that they feel there is a danger to Canada's cultural sovereignty, right? So this idea that Canadian culture is some sort of tangible, identifiable thing that is under threat because Canadians are not watching enough of the right kind of videos online. Right? So it's very important to be very clear to understand what is sort of like the ideological motivation that is animating this. And I think that sometimes we can speak of sort of legislation as if it's just sort of something that's kind of unfolding on its own sort of accord. But no, like, you know, I spend a lot of time thinking about politics. You know, I've been a political commentator for like 10 years, so maybe my analysis is a little bit more sort of politicized, a little bit more cynical perhaps. But the thing that winds up sort of generating a lot of the anxiety if we assume that the animating sort of purpose of this legislation is to protect our cultural sovereignty is the question of, well, who gets to decide what that means? Who gets to decide what Canadian culture is? Who gets to decide when Canadian culture is being threatened or undermined or is in some sort of danger that requires government's helping hand to protect? And we do know that the agenda of this government, and, you know, broadly the government of Ottawa for the last, you know, however many decades, is the idea that Canadian culture is something that requires a sort of government-led sort of initiative to sort of protect and defend and build. The idea that the culture of this country is ultimately something that Ottawa will have a guiding hand in sort of, you know, instigating and sort of protecting and driving more broadly. And I think that that is something that just many Canadian content creators are sort of frankly terrified by. They don't like the idea that they have to dance to some sort of government tune and that their success as content creators, their livelihood, will in some ways be dependent on their ability to make their content conform with what some sort of council of, you know, of experts, sort of self-proclaimed adjudicators of what is in the cultural interest of this country to decide. And, you know, so when we talk about like the CRTC, right, it's very important that we sort of understand what we're talking about here. Because like the CRTC is a body that the Parliament of Canada, and this is increasingly how a lot of legislation in this country works, right? The Parliament passes laws or passes legislation that basically delegates authority to some other body. To some body of the executive branch, which in this case is the CRTC. The Parliament sort of draws broad guidelines and then says to some other body, you basically make all of the tough decisions because we as politicians are terrified of being held accountable for our own decisions, so we just dump as much of that as possible on someone else. And so what the anxiety is that, you know, this legislation is sort of, as we hear from the conversations about it, it's broad and vague and contradictory and confusing. But, you know, the politicians are happy to just dump it all on the CRTC and you make the decision. And I think that that causes a lot of concern because then it's like, ultimately at the end of the day, it's the CRTC, it's this sort of council of shadowy figures who are going to be making the decisions as to like, what is content that is Canadian enough to be promoted in order to sort of fulfill this kind of like broad and rambling mandate to preserve the sort of the Canadian cultural common good. What is Canadian enough to deserve promotion? What is Canadian enough to deserve discoverability? You know, what is Canadian enough to fulfill the government's idea of what is in this country's national cultural interest? And, you know, on my channel, I spend a lot of time talking about culture. I spend a lot of time examining what it is, what culture is, you know, not only in the Canadian context, but around the world. And my personal belief, and frankly I think the belief of most Canadians and certainly most content creators, is that culture is sort of what Canadians experience. And, you know, what Canadians make is Canadian culture. You know, we can make Canadian culture, you know, it can take the form of a video about, you know, cooking Thai food. That can be Canadian culture. You know, sort of makeup tutorials can be culture. You know, fitness tutorials can be culture. This is all culture. This is all the richness of what it is to be Canadian and the elaborate, diverse, wonderful country that we inhabit. And YouTubers, creators of all sorts, we share our experiences of our daily lives as Canadians. And I think that the wonderful nature of an unregulated YouTube is that you've just been able to see content succeed or fail based on its popularity, accessibility, relevance to the lives of Canadian audiences, right? It's an audience-first approach that I think has made us all, successful and has created so many hours of so much, deeply, deeply useful and important and culturally enriching content for this country and the world. And I think to see this tremendous success story as a problem to be solved, as a problem that government must now sort of stick itself into and sort of say, no, we'll fix this. To me, that is preposterous and it is deeply unnerving, and I think content creators are right to be deeply, deeply troubled by it.
Thank you. JJ, I think you wanted to say something. You were looking at me?
Oh, I was just saying that I do think it's important that when we think about like sort of the process of Canadian content certification, that how that will be defined is still very much in the air, right? So it's true that there's sort of an existing architecture that is used to certify, and this is like just, to me, this strikes me as just such a preposterous thing that exists in a free society. The idea that you can be certifiably Canadian, right? The idea that there's some government body somewhere that can certify your Canadianness, right? But in any case, this does exist in the current sort of legal regime for conventional media. So there is there's a standard that you can meet in order to be a certifiably Canadian musician, or as you said, specifically, it's not even the artist, it's the content specifically, a certifiably Canadian song, a certifiably Canadian episode of a TV show or a movie, right? So there's standards that exist in place to certify that. But we don't necessarily know that those rules will also be the rules that are used to certify the Canadianness of a YouTube video or a TikTok or whatever, right? The CRTC can dream up an entirely new sort of standard of verifying your Canadianness that might be much more strict than the current metrics, which are already, kind of odd and preposterous, right? Because we do know that the way that the government, Bill C-11 does provide sort of broad instruction to the CRTC that they will ultimately refine. But it is very sort of like long and rambly, and it has a lot of sort of ideological goals about promoting this, promoting that, a certain conception of what is in the Canadian cultural interest to do. So I just wanted to just kind of like reinforce the point that exactly what standard will be used to certify your Canadianness, your Canadianness, to determine you're Canadian enough to be promoted, to be easier, to be boosted, to be more discoverable than the insufficiently Canadian content. We don't know what those standards will be, and they could be just about anything. So it's right to be worried about them. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm sort of, maybe I'm a little idealistic, or not in terms of this bill itself, but in terms of like what I would ask for if I could sort of have my druthers. Because there's sort of like two kind of competing interests that I'm a little bit sort of sympathetic to. As much as I'm not sympathetic to this bill at all, I can sort of see one of sort of the contrary sort of like rebuttal arguments that could be made to people like me. And one of the things is this appeal to a sense of sort of fairness, right? Like the idea that the legacy media, the legacy broadcasters feel that they have to play by a set of rules that are kind of smothering and conforming in terms of the Canadian content, getting the Canadian certification, and as you said, Morgan, like they have to air so much Canadian content during certain hours of the day, and it's a big hassle. And I'm sympathetic to the idea that they don't like having to do all of this. They don't like having to bear this heavy regulatory burden that the CRTC has imposed upon them. And then they look at like YouTube, TikTok, whatever, that we just get to do whatever we want, and we get to thrive and succeed purely on the popularity of audience appeal. We don't have to sort of make these sacrifices to serve the good sort of to defend the Canadian cultural sovereignty, right? And so I'm sensitive to that complaint. My argument would be, my sort of response to that would be, okay, well, how about we lessen the regulatory burden on television and radio, right? How about if we enter a bold new era in which we put audience interests first? How about that for an idea, right? So that would be my kind of compromise solution, is that in order to sort of appease the legacy media that I really do believe are the special interests that are sort of fundamentally puppeteering this whole legislation, how about if we seek to appease them by just easing their regulatory burden and sort of just making a much more level playing field, rather than sort of bringing us down to their level? What if we just kind of raise everyone up and give everyone a little bit more creative freedom to sort of put audience needs first and sink or swim according to that? you know, that might be a little too idealistic, which then gets to sort of like the second interest, which is just, you know, frankly money, right? So I think that the other sort of anxiety is that, you know, YouTube, the social media sort of streaming services and so on are sort of not paying enough into the pot. So then the question, you know, because we have this sort of other sort of system in this country wherein, you know, legacy media pays into the Canadian content creator fund thing, which then, you know, some Ottawa bureaucrats sort of sprinkle across the country to, you know, media enterprises and creative projects that they deemed to be in need of tax dollars in order to serve the Canadian cultural interest and protect our sovereignty and all this. And then so like my question is like, you know, I don't work for YouTube, so maybe it's easy for me to say, it's like, okay, how much will that cost? Like, just like how many more zeros do you want on the bill in order to make, you know, the regulatory burden go away, right? Because I do think like at the end of the day, if these big corporations could just maybe pay a little bit more to Ottawa, I mean, this sounds very crass and very cynical, but you know, politics is a cynical business. So it's like, if we could just, you know, if the big sort of corporations just pay a little bit more to Ottawa in order to sort of plump up this fund that they then like to, as I said, sprinkle around to their sort of preferred interest groups and to prop up, you know, various, you know, media projects, you know, your film or whatever, you want some subsidies from Ottawa, you know, that money has to come from somewhere, right? Just how much will it take? Like, if we give more money, can we maybe trade that off for regulatory burden? That would be sort of my my sort of cynical
Throw
approach.
money at the problem.
Can we throw money at the
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So a lot of creators probably want to speak out on this, but they don't want to be perceived as political.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to get political, man. I don't want everybody coming
I
for me.
completely understand
That's
that.
like the first thing. It's like, you hear about this bill, yeah, let's do it. You guys do it. I will wait and see what happens. Like, I feel like a lot of creators have that. What are you guys you guys are creators, you know, JJ's obviously spoken out on this at length. What are your tips for getting that message across for maybe somebody who isn't as political or doesn't want to really offend anybody, just wants to get the message across in a clean and effective way? Because my fear is that like creators just are like, yeah, like I hope everybody talks about this, but they don't actually talk about it. Like, how can we do it in a clean way, I guess is my question.
What I would just say quickly is that, you know, like I'm somebody that's, you know, I'm a political commentator by nature. I follow the political process pretty closely. And this has not really been perceived as like a partisan issue. You know, creators on the left, right, and center have all spoken out on it. And frankly, you know, if I'm going to be just sort of like political about this, I think that the Liberal Party and the NDP are rather kind of defensive about this. Like, they're not eager to be promoting this because they realize that there's very little public support for this. And certainly there's very little creator support for this. So I think that, like, you know, even if you're on the left and you know, you don't want to be perceived as being, you know, like somebody who's kind of like bashing the parties of your choice, like, all the more reason to speak out, because like if you're a person of the left, I think it's important that you hold your own side accountable in the same way that if you're a person of the right, it's also important that you hold the governing party accountable. So I think that, like, regardless of where your political opinions lie, I think there's a perfectly defensible reason to sort of speak out against it, because we're all citizens of a democracy. We all have a right to exercise our opinions, and as long as like you're keeping your commentary focused on the substance of the legislation, you know, you're not just saying, oh, old man Trudeau up to his old tricks again, right? You're actually sort of saying, like, I'm like, regardless of who I vote for, regardless of who my party preferences are, I'm a citizen of this democracy. This is legislation that affects my bottom line, my interests, and I have a right to speak out of it. I'll speak it in a sort of like in a respectful way, not a sort of heavy-handed, overly dogmatic, politicized way, but, you know, feel comfortable to do it because it affects you and you have a right to speak.